The topic for today's video: if I only could have one EQ in my arsenal, what would I choose? One EQ to rule them all, one EQ to bind them. Spoiler alert, it is going to be Fab Filters Pro Q3, so if that's all you care about, you can go ahead and stop the video. For anybody who's still hanging on, I'm going to go through and talk about why, for me, this would be the only one that I would need if I was in that situation where I only could have one. We are lucky, we are spoiled, we are blessed that we have a multitude of all different types of processors. EQs especially, there's like a million of them that are out there, but every once in a while it's good to take a step back, remind ourselves that nothing's really essential, and that if it came down to it, maybe 5 or 6 plugins would really hurt us if we lost them. And this would probably be one of them, but not really, I think. And we'll talk about that as we continue on with the video, that even if I didn't have this one, my life really wouldn't change. I'd still be able to attain the same sonic kind of results with a different EQ. It's just the amount of time that it would take me to do that and the annoyances. So I might be less likely to process sounds a certain way just because it's more of a pain to do it. So let's jump into the DAW and let's go through some examples and talk about EQ. Let's do it. Luckily, we do have access to more than one EQ, and I'm just going to showcase a few of the ones that I use. I actually don't really think I use more than this. The Lindell channel, I will use the 80s one occasionally. I don't always use that EQ module, but sometimes. So here we have Air Windows, Baxandall. I tend to bring this on after I've brought in a sample from somewhere, and just as a very quick tonal control, it can usually get me in the ballpark right away. The Axis EQ, these are like API models, and then there's more of a unique UBK model. I never use this one because it's not stepped. For that reason, I would go more traditional parametric, but I do use these A and B models. They sound great, can't complain. We have a couple more from Analog Obsession, the BXQ, Fiverr, and Rare. I like the sound of this one, and this one I can manage. Sometimes when I look at EQs like this, they're a little bit overwhelming, but I like the frequency ranges on these guys. So you have 30 to 300, 50 to 400, 330 to 2.5K, 1.8 to 16K, and then 2.5 to 25K. So that's very easy for me to manage. So I do occasionally use this on different source materials. If I want something kind of special, I'll give that a try and see if it helps. The BXQ, I would love an updated version that has a link control. I actually made a preset with a link control, but I never use it. So this gets used for me a lot of times on buses of synthesizers, or occasionally I might try it on the master bus, but typically on buses of synths, and I'll use the mid side to kind of enhance things. We have our classic Pultec style. There's a million of these out there. There's a million free ones, a million paid ones. Just does what it's supposed to do. Again, you could use that in mastering context. I use it on bass a lot. You know, there you go. We have the Lufticus, which we have talked about before, so I won't go into detail. It's like the Mag EQ. Love being able to go stepped control. Love the keep gain feature. And then we have the kind of Magic Air. The Manny American EQ, if you watch the Waves video, you already know my thoughts on this one. I wish this just had a stepped control, but a lot like the Fiverr, I might just throw this on something just to see if it really adds something to it, because all of those bands are nice. So this is more of an additive one. And then finally, the TDR SlickEQ. And this was the one that was the closest to maybe being my one and only EQ, if not for a few downfalls. So we will talk about that later, but thank God we're not limited to just one, because this tends to be my go-to shaping EQ after using something parametric. And again, you can see that we have the ability to go stepped. We also have the ability to use a modifier key to go out of stepped mode if we need to do that, but I tend to always keep this in stepped, and I think it works great. It has so many different features on it, including the saturation and the ability to go with a steeper peak, things like that. I usually use this in either American, British, or German mode. I don't think I've ever used the Japanese or the Soviet mode. Nova would definitely be a candidate for an EQ that could be your one and only EQ. It is capable of doing pretty much everything you would need. But I do think that just all of the controls and just the user interface in general kind of detracts from it if it was used in that way, if it was your one and only EQ. I think it's great. It's very transparent. But yeah, let's just go ahead and set it up real quick so you can just see how it kind of has all the features. Here are our drums. We've got a FFT if we need it. Bring in a high pass filter, bring in a low pass filter. Right now you'll see that I have it working in a stepped mode, which is what I usually like to do. But if you need more surgical stuff, you also have the ability to use a modifier key. In this case, it's a right click, and then I could kind of fine tune this a little bit more. Just as an example there's no way to kind of add a bump unless you were to go in and, do it with a different band. As you can see, this is kind of just locked in. So you can still click and drag around if you want to do that. We then have our different bands that we can use, and we could set this up as just a static EQ. Again, it's very musical sounding, very transparent and flattering. Okay, something like that. But then we can also use it in more of the dynamic sense. So on specific frequency bands, or if you click out here, you could have the whole signal then move in more of like a standard type compression deal. Let's try to find that little snap on the snare that's coming through, and we'll enhance it because we can do that with Nova. So let's go back in here. I'm going to turn off these other bands, and we'll go to band number 2. Solo it out. Turn our threshold on, and we're going to go down to kind of like a negative threshold, so below 1, and that's going to add enhancement. You can hear that. We'll just leave our attack and release settings as they are. This is an auto release setting. Maybe I'll turn this down a little bit. Okay, turn band solo off. You also have the option to change the quality setting or even change the curves to be more surgical if you're trying to pick out a particular resonance. It has a smart ops option where you then have the ability to do some of these AI operations. I personally never use it, but it is there. I don't know how good or how bad it is, so I'm not going to comment, but it is an option. And then the other thing we have the ability to do, which is very important for an everyday EQ, is the ability to sidechain based on a different signal that's coming in, and also to view that signal. So let's set that up really quickly. So as you can see, we have this set up here onto our wavy pad keys, and this is what they sound like. But if you notice, this is definitely jumping around based on not the sound of the keys. It's doing it reacting to the drums. So in Bitwig, the way you set that up is you click this button, you choose your sidechain input. We have chosen our drums pre, and then when you go into the plugin, you just have to make sure you choose external sidechain. And with this band, we're just kind of dropping these out of the way of those snares and stuff. So you can see, which band is it? I think it's band number 5. One thing that would be nice is by default, if all of these were like turned off. So here we go. You can see it moving around. Here you can see our sidechain source. And now let's hear it with the drums. So again, a super transparent, smooth kind of a sound. And I do like using it in these applications, but it's not kind of my everyday EQ because it's just not super fast to work with. You know, I have to go through, click a lot of things. There's a lot going on here. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just the reason why I wouldn't want this to be my one and only. Also, if you had to work with this thing like in mid-side, it's really kind of a pain. I'm not even going to set it up because I don't do it. It's just not intuitive or fast. But otherwise, this is an amazing EQ and definitely one that you could get away with if you only had one. Another plugin I considered just briefly to be my one and only would be the DAW SlickEQ. Very impressive EQ. It's probably my third most used, and it's the sort of thing that I use as like a molder. So after I've done parametric, I might bring this in to just shape the tone a little bit further. Doesn't do any dynamic stuff. You can't solo out bands as far as I know. Maybe you can, and I've just never figured out or have never done it. And also working it mid-side, it's not that easy to do. I actually would set up a mid-side thing in Bitwig and just put an instance of it in both. But because of that extra step, I just don't use it for that function or that purpose. But anyway, as an EQ, it's very good. It has a lot of different modes and things. So again, you can do stepped or continuous. Have a tilt filter. That's kind of cool. Let's go extreme with it. Why not? So I've just kind of set up a kind of crazy curve here. You also have the ability to turn on the saturation. I think that only occurs on the gains. So let's turn that on and pick something. Let's just do silky. Drive it all the way in, listen to the other modes. I think I like that one the best, just on quick listen. Has that auto gain feature, which is great, and I just leave that on so that you can actually hear the tonal changes that you've made without actually hearing the gain changes that you've made in the process. So that is the TDR SlickEQ. I also should mention we have different curves. And in this particular instance, because I set it up with the American model, I think it sounds best with the American model on. We are now down to our final two EQs, and one of the ones is your built-in EQ, or specifically in this case, the one that comes in Bitwig, the EQ Plus. And this is a very flexible EQ, especially if you know how the rest of Bitwig Studio works, in the fact that you can save presets, like you can have a mid-side EQ already ready to go. You can have this thing set up to be a dynamic EQ right out of the gate. And let's just turn the inspector on, because the inspector will be useful for us here, or we can actually pop this all the way out. And we have a lot of flexibility depending on how we want to go about it. We can even bring this window all the way out and it becomes something closer to like the Fab Filter. So for example, here with the drums, we can solo. And we can also change the steepness here. Nice. That's my biggest issue. I tend to accidentally create bands all the time. And then you could also do shelves. And if you notice, when you isolate it, you can also then change the Q values, which is very handy. I just have a tough time keeping things selected. And that's really the EQ Plus in a nutshell, but we can obviously take it steps further. We can make this thing dynamic, and then we can also make it sidechain dynamic. And I do that by setting up a modulator, and we'll use the audio sidechain. We could also use the envelope follower. By default, this will be set up to the device input, and then I can isolate a frequency range. So I actually have to kind of listen first. Okay, so we might dip out there a little bit. So I'm gonna isolate that range in here. And now I'm going to go, and it's probably better to have this clicked, but I'm gonna select it and I'm gonna start to bring down the gain. And the thing that I love the most about this is the fact that we can then determine how that slope is moving. So we have peak, we have RMS. So I can really slow it down. And then we're going to add another one in. The one thing that kind of stinks is that we would be stuck with these same settings unless I add another instance in, which I'm going to do. So here you can see we've now set it up. We have two different ranges being selected and two very different settings on how that gain is going to move. And let's take a listen. So very cool, very unique, not something that you're going to see every single day. And that's why I really love it. I do believe that this alone is what kind of takes this EQ into that your one and only EQ you could potentially ever need. Now, remember, you can set stuff like this up on plugins and have it control those gain controls, but it just may not be as smooth or like, you know, just as easy as it is to set up and visualize and see here. The other thing we can do, just like we looked at before in the Nova, is to set up a side chain, and we'll do that down here on this little vocal part. So this time we're gonna select our drums. And it's very easy for us to isolate this in on the kick drum. I'm just going to mute everything just so you don't get annoyed. And we can see where that kick energy is. So I'm going to isolate this in on the kick drum. And then we'll just do one big band and have it just really cutting tons and tons of stuff. And we'll be really extreme with it. Why not? And I definitely need to change these settings. We'll have it rise in right away and fall nice and slowly if we can. Okay, and let's take a listen to this now. This will be interesting. So you can hear when that low end hits. And what's crazy is we could have something else like dancing differently, even in the same range potentially. So let's set up the exact same thing, audio sidechain. And again, we'll use the drums, but this time we're gonna isolate a section up here that's just moving a lot more. Talk about adding movement into your sound, and it's not being done in any of the standard or traditional ways. And, you know, this is one of these things that in Bitwig, I can't help myself but to experiment and show you, but we could bring on something like an LFO and we could just set that to the frequency, and we'll listen to kind of how crazy this then makes it. So there you go. So there's an example of the EQ Plus. Obviously, we've now taken this into creative territory, but it's worth mentioning that too, because we're not going to really talk about that with the Fab Filter Pro Q. We're not going to use it in a creative sense. And for that reason, this EQ Plus maybe is debatably just as important, as flexible, and could serve the purpose of the one and only EQ as the Pro Q, which we're going to look at now. We've talked up a lot of other EQs so far, and I do use all of those EQs, but if I could only have one and I had to give away everything else, I could do it in exchange for the Fab Filter Pro Q, and I'm going to talk about why that is exactly. Apart from that last little example I showed you in the EQ Plus, the Fab Filter Pro Q can do all of those things and better and faster. And that's the reason why I like it so much. It's because of the speed and the user interface. Now, one thing you're going to see right off the bat is in Bitwig, I can create device presets. So I've made a device preset here called Brian Filters These are the Pro Q filters, and I can actually work with these way faster than I can work with the ones in Bitwig, and I'll show you why. So I bring this in, you can see that I have these remote controls set up here, and I have high pass, low pass filter. Turn on my high pass, increase my slope, lock that bad boy in, maybe add a little enhancement. Same thing with my low pass. Great sound on these. I have no problem automating that. And then we have an output control. So I don't have a Q control on the low pass filter because I rarely to ever use that. Likewise, I could still go in here and I could grab things and I could pull it up and change it around if I wanted to, but just wanted to show you that right off the bat that I can do this way faster in the Pro Q than I can do it inside of even the EQ Plus. When we look at it, it really is just a standard EQ type plugin where I can create bands, I can solo out regions, I can use modifier keys in the ways that I would expect, and everything's just very intuitive. The ability to kind of visualize what's going on is just so much easier in this one than in pretty much any other equalizer type plugin. So we can do stuff like highlight this and it's giving us kind of where these resonant peaks are occurring. Stuff like that is very useful. So apart from this EQ just sounding really good and the fact that you can bring up so many indicators and visualizers, let's look at, one of these visualizers here. Just amazing that you have access to that sort of a thing. It's also the ease of use with this thing that takes it to the next level and the ability to set things up very quickly. So I've been kind of complaining about mid-side in all of these other EQs that we've looked at. And mid-side works fine in that EQ Plus with Bitwig when you set up the container, but you can have this all in the Pro Q in just a couple of clicks. So I can create a band, go down here, put this into mid mode, and then I can click that little button, and now I have a mid and a side band that I can work with, and I can isolate. Let's go over to that mid band and say, okay, I want to enhance that there. Now let me go over to my side band, and let's really increase this. It needs it. It's just having the ability and access to do all these things. Let's say we wanted to enhance that snare sound. Okay, I'm going to add a new band. This is band number 3. Okay, let's enhance that. Let's make this dynamic. So as you can see with this setup, this is all just so quick and so easy, and I can get any task I want done very, very quickly. And that's what I appreciate about it. So it just works so much faster than anything else you've probably ever used. And that's the reason why I think this is kind of the standard go-to EQ for most people, and for myself as well, because it just works so much faster. Everything in here makes sense. Really, really appreciate that. And again, we can just listen. Not only have we done some mid-side, but we've also even done a little bit of dynamic EQ, and we'll also set up the side chain EQ as well here, what we did before with the EQ Plus. So let's just do that really quickly. One thing that's worth mentioning also is the fact that you can name these various instances, which is going to be helpful for us. As you can see, this one has been named drums already, and I have some of these EQs set up on different channels. The little red lines are going to tell you where potentially you might have masking. So let's go ahead and set it up as we would. We'll go into our side chain, make sure that we tell this thing that this is coming from the drums. And there we can see that analyzer in the background of the drums. And now if I go in here and say, okay, I want to knock out a bunch here, I'll make this dynamic. And now I have to go into auto mode. And we have our sidechain turned on. And set our range. So again, the thing that's just so cool about this is you have access to so many different EQ modes, all from one plugin window, and they just work the way you're expecting it to work. You can even make this view bigger if you want to. There's an EQ match function, which I've never used before, but it's there. I assume it works quite well. Everything Fab Filter does is usually on point. And that's gonna do it for this video. So reminders is that, you know, luckily we have more than just one EQ that we can use, but if I only had to pick one, it probably would be the Q3. So thank you for watching and have a wonderful day. Take care.